Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. We're moving on to our penultimate unit in this course on the topic of personal identity. We warmed up to it a little bit previously by discussing self-knowledge, self-examination, but that discussion presupposes that we have a concept of what it is to be a self, what part of ourselves we think is worth examining, that, for example, examining yourself in the sense that's relevant to philosophy, many people assume is not so much a matter of examining your body, but rather examining aspects of your mind, including the cognitive, affective, and experiential components. But one might ask, to what extent do those three components or dimensions hang together into a notion of a coherent self? That is a question that's raised in the topic of personal identity. Now, when we talk about personal identity, we are thinking about what it is to be a person over time, the same person over a period of time, as well as what it is to be a person at a single moment of time. I'll come back and expand on that distinction in just a moment, but first let me introduce you to someone that we've mentioned before but have not discussed very much, John Locke. His dates were 1632 to 1704. He was the first modern empiricist. He was the source of the idea of a tabula rasa, the metaphor suggesting that our minds at birth are empty slates or blank slates, and that experience writes on them, and that is the way that we gain information, according to Locke's version of empiricism. Locke was friends with Isaac Newton, and Locke was also influenced by Descartes, but wanted to disagree with him on a number of fundamental points. And John Locke also wrote political theories, developed political theories that were immensely influential, including on American founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and many others. So these fathers of American democracy were busy reading John Locke when they were in college, and thereafter were very influenced by his understanding about the proper organization of a state. Now, for Locke, the significance of personhood is very wide and very profound. And if he were with us today, I suspect he would say, understanding what it is to be a person at a time, as well as to be the same person over time, is going to help give us insight into questions concerning such contested topics as abortion, artificial intelligence, animal rights, euthanasia, and moral responsibility for acts that we might have performed either a long time ago or in potentially altered states of mind due to drugs, due to psychiatric disorders, etc. What counts as being the same person is going to, how we theorize about what it is to be the same person is going to have implications for important topics such as these. Now, to make that distinction between two kinds of personal identity, two aspects of personal identity, I want to use the words diachronic and synchronic. A diachronic question of identity asks what it is for an entity A at time t to be one and the same thing as entity B at time t plus 1 or t prime. So if we're just talking about identity generally as opposed to personal identity specifically, diachronic questions of identity ask, what is it for this same thing to persist over a period of time and be the same object that was there before? For example, when Descartes discusses in the second meditation the example involving the piece of wax, he assumes, and I think the reader is naturally wanting to assume with him, that it's the same wax that undergoes those changes of melting, getting hot, and so on. Even though many of its sensible properties change, it's the same thing. Locke says it's still the same wax, no one would deny it. And insofar as he's doing that, he's assuming that the piece of wax has diachronic identity. Whereas synchronic identity is a question not primarily concerned with passage of time, but rather concerns the question what it is at any given time for a thing to be an entity of a certain sort. So what is it for a hunk of matter to be, for example, a living thing? And what is it for a living thing to be a mammal? What is it for a mammal to be a human being? Are all synchronic questions that depend on not so much how the thing persists through time, but what characteristics it has to have at a moment to qualify as having a certain status. Take an example of a metaphysical question about the persistence of an object over time. A famous one concerns what's known as the ship of Theseus. Suppose that in the year 1800 there was a brand new, just built ship called the Theseus ship, or Theseus's ship. Theseus owns it, and it's brand new. It's just leaving the dock for its maiden voyage. This is the year 1800. And then in 1805, it comes back, and a couple of planks have been damaged. Maybe a little bit of rot has set in, and so those planks are replaced. Goes back out to sea. Then in 1822, it comes back to dock, and a number of planks have to be replaced because more rot. This is standard in ships made of wood, and so these are replaced with new, fresh planks. Then this process continues over a period of many years, all the way, suppose, until 1900, when not a single plank from the original 1800 ship exists on the 1900 ship, so that there's no physical continuity in the sense that there's no one particle of matter on the 1900 ship that was there on the 1800 ship. Now, even though that is the case, many of us, I suspect, would hold that so long as the replacement of the planks has been relatively gradual and done over a long enough period of time, and so long as the thing still is the same artifact that it was before, that is, serves as a ship to, for example, convey cargo from one continent to another, then Theseus's ship still exists in the year 1900. So that we still have the same ship that was there before, even though the parts have changed and over time so drastically that there's not a single particle of matter in common between the 1900 ship and the 1800 ship. That's a natural thought, and a metaphysician, someone who's concerned with these metaphysical questions, might very well ask, that's all well and good, but notice that you might also wonder what would happen. Suppose somebody had preserved all the discarded planks and cleaned them up and solved their rot problems and got them into working order again and built a ship out of those discarded planks to the exact specifications as Theseus's original ship was built to. So that in the year 1900, we've got two ships that are physically exactly duplicates of each other. One is made out of all the same material that Theseus's original ship is made out of. The other one is made out of entirely new materials. Which one is now Theseus's ship, or are they both? How do we answer that question? I'm not sure that I'm ready to provide an answer to that, but that's a question that's subject to debate. But at least in the case of the original example, in which we have piecemeal replacement of planks, and we seem to have the same ship all the same that exists at the end of that 100-year process, that's an example of diachronic identity that I want you to think about as you think about diachronic identity for other things besides artifacts that are involved in sailing. Now, many philosophers will say that an artifact like a ship or a pair of shoes or a building seems to have its diachronic identity secured by its being treated as one and the same object over time, and more specifically, not just being treated as such, but by also having the same function as it had in the original instance. So that as long as the thing is still used to sail, as opposed, for example, being put in a museum, then even if there's lots of replacement of the parts, we still have the same ship as it applies to artifacts. Whereas you might ask, is there a similar theory that we could apply to identity over time for things like animals and vegetables? Well, there are answers that might be given. Locke says this: an oak growing from a plant to a great tree and then lopped, that is cut down, is still the same oak, or if not cut down, that is at least trimmed and pruned. It's still the same oak. And a colt grown up to a horse, sometimes fat, sometimes lean, is all the while the same horse, though in both cases there may be a manifest change of parts. Maybe there's no single cell in common between the colt and the grown-up horse. So that truly, they're not either of them the same masses of matter, though they be truly one of them the same oak and the other the same horse. So Locke wants to suggest you can have the identity of an animal or a vegetable, including a tree, over time, so long as it seems to, well, he would say, partake in the same life. He'll say a living organism such as a plant or an animal with the different stages all being part of the same life, living entity, are what counts as identity of such a thing over time, even if all the parts have changed.